While the success of Crap at stealing the Insulmultanese cultural relics was a direct threat to Steve and Almera, he had a plan to undo their work with haste. However, his plan was complicated by further developments in the war between Almera and a growing number of coalition nations. The small neutral nation of Nomium was being pressured by the coalition to join the war on their side, which would provide them an excellent port to disembark at and strike into Almeran territory. The gnomes, however, were nervous about this idea, considering they were surrounded by Almerans and had seen the smaller gnome-sized crosses the Almerans were building. Just in case. In an effort to show the strength of the coalition, the remains of the Alsaurian army marched north from their capital, with fresh reinforcements from the other elven kingdoms, dwarven warriors, and even some Kasurian knights who were rushed across the banded ocean. However, rather than finding Consul Gary and his legions out in the open, they came across a freshly built Almeran fort that hadn't been there before. The coalition, not expecting a siege, had to try and regroup and prepare to encircle the fort. Meanwhile, the Almerans used their smaller scorpion ballistae to constantly harass and whittle away at the coalition forces, especially the cavalry. Then, in the middle of the night, the Almerans abandoned the fort, setting fire to it just as they left. This started a string of similar encounters where the Almerans would march faster than the main coalition army could manage, and their cavalry was wary to proceed alone. So once they caught up, the Almerans had taken refuge in another fort. The coalition forces, having never fought with the Almerans before, had no idea that they would build and destroy forts with ease. The orc wargs and limited Almeran cavalry would harass and defend the flanks to prevent each fort from being surrounded and then pull back as night fell. So the coalition continued to pursue and continued to prepare a siege only for the Almerans to slip away in the night, with each fort burnt behind them. Increasingly frustrated with the consul's refusal to meet them in an open battle, the nobility of the coalition spoke at length about his lack of honor and integrity, and began to think the Almerans were nothing but opportunistic cowards. When the coalition army finally came across the consul's legions arrayed for battle in an open field with their backs to a mountain, instead of behind the walls of a fort, they figured their time for battle had finally come. They formed ranks and met the Almerans in battle in the late morning. By early afternoon, the Almerans had been pushed back across the field, but the coalition leaders mistook this for his imminent defeat rather than merely his plan all along. Around mid-afternoon, the reinforcement legions that the Senate had sent south arrived, their approach hidden by the foothills of the mountain. The coalition found themselves suddenly outnumbered significantly, which had been the consul's reason for delay all along. The coalition forces broke then into a disorganized retreat, with the Kasurian knights escaping the field of battle so fast the Almeran soldiers joked that their horses ran faster backwards than forwards. To their credit, however, they were the only group of cavalry that managed to secure some of the coalition baggage train in the retreat. The dwarves, meanwhile, knowing they couldn't outrun the Almerans or their orc allies, opted for a valiant rearguard defense to give the rest of the army time to escape. These two actions ensured that many more of the coalition army could retreat to the capital. When they arrived, they were badly disorganized, tired, and hungry, but they were alive. This defeat had a mixed effect on the war effort at large. The gnomes decided to formally and legally establish their neutral status with the Almerans in exchange for tithes and taxes. But it also strengthened the resolve of the eastern nations to build a navy capable of ferrying more troops across the banded ocean. Especially more knights and the heavy dwarven constructs that, while limited in number in the battle, had shown to be more effective in combat with the Almerans. On the Almeran side, their limitations in cavalry were proven to be worrisome, as if only they'd been able to capitalize on the victory and chase down the coalition army, they might have ended the war early. But the coalition forces had left behind something so simple and ubiquitous among their forces that none realized how grave a threat it was to let the Almerans discover it: the stirrup. Knowing that the coalition needed a bigger navy more than ever, and worried what it could mean for the war effort if the Insulmultae ships and designs were given to a new Kasurian king, Steve had to double down on his efforts to undo what he saw as his own personal failure. While King Dwayne was honor-bound to exile Steve and the others, he gave them a way out. Should they return the relics and ensure the islanders didn't fall under the sway of a foreign king, they could return. So Steve needed a plan. Despite his own opinion of crap, their record as adventurers was so far impeccable. They were known far and wide as good and noble adventurers who smote evil, brought justice, and uplifted the downtrodden. If they were found to have stolen artifacts for an evil king so he could enslave their people, it would go a long way towards adjusting their image in the eyes of the people. To say nothing of exposing the machinations of the Kasurian throne. Many nobles were wary of the concept of an enemy exploiting ancient cultural loopholes to claim dynasty over foreign lands. However, to do these things, Steve needed proof. He only knew of one place to find it. A place of magic run foul in the worst of ways. The ancient Kadajul Bayou had long been avoided by the elves of the eastern continent Myzenia, despite being positioned in a very advantageous region on the southeast of the continent, at the end of the massive Casilian River, and a short journey across the divided sea from Kavika and the important trade posts of the Tusk coast. They had avoided the bayou completely. Or rather, the civilized elves had. It lay unused and avoided until humans foolish, desperate, or crazy enough to try and tame the swamp finally settled the region. Technically, the entire delta was claimed by the human kingdom of Ormorlean, but the Eldefleur flag only flew over a single port city of Soirais, and the rest of the delta was more or less unexplored and uncivilized. Legends, myths, and tales of witches, spirits, and dark ones filled the land. While Steve typically dismissed most rumors of evil witches as nothing but yarns spun by bards to get good tips in taverns, he knew the truth of the bayou better than most. It was a dark place where all manner of magic service could be bought and sold, such as a mysterious illness befalling an older brother leaving the throne open for another, much like had happened to King Garland's older brother decades before. And Steve knew that if a king owed you a favor, you were going to hold the evidence close. Thankfully, Ormorlean had been neutral so far, and they had no love of their Kasurian rivals to the north, meaning Steve was still welcome in their lands. So while many bards of the bayou loved to tell the tale of what they thought was the Spellslinger's first trip to the delta, they only know part of the tale. They speak of adventure, treasure, and evil, but they don't understand he wasn't there for adventure alone. He was there to tread into the darkness and illuminate the past. This is a story about how Spellslinger brings the light. Are you sure we couldn't stay in the city a little longer? I really liked it there. The little crawly food was amazing. Though I couldn't stop slobbering while I ate it, Fenrina said, as Steve pushed them away from the city and further into the swamp. The flatboat they had was little more than a raft with edges, since there were never any serious waves in the bayou. It was also useful for moving through the incredibly shallow yet dark and brackish waters. We don't exactly have the luxury of time, you know, and I told you that food was several different kinds of hot, though I'll admit that it was mesmerizing in a horrifying kind of way to watch you cry and drip snot into the bucket of crawdads even as you ate more. Steve mentioned, well, they were just so good. It was like even though it hurt, I just had to have more. Fenrina nodded with a big smile, not seeming to have minded the hygienic nightmare that she'd presented them with while she ate. What were those little balls of meat? Those were great too. Larry has a wonderful recipe for those tasty, Larry's savory salty balls. The ladies love them as much as they love Larry Love. Let me make some up for you, sugar. You'll love 'em too. The dwarf grinned, but before Fenrina could look at him, Steve smacked him upside the head just before Sherry smacked him up the other side of the head, leaving him dazed for a moment from the double attack. He held up his hands to ward of any other blows, but they were satisfied for now. Oh, that would be great! Fenrina beamed happily as she wagged her tail, the entire concept of double entendre totally unknown to her, which in time would make her communications with the Ormorleans confusing. As they loved them so much, the phrase was named using an old Ormorlean word. But I would like to come back at some point, she went on. We'll see about coming back if you like. It's a bit of an odd city, even if I do find it refreshing compared to most of the other urban environments on this otherwise prudish continent. One of the few where most of the rumors don't even do it proper justice. Most mages wouldn't be caught dead there considering the implication. Steve mentioned as he kept pushing them along with a long wooden pole. Larry loves the city. I come here every year for the Cleansing Tide Festival, especially the bead-throwing bit, Larry mentioned. Yeah, that doesn't surprise me, Steve replied with a roll of his eyes, making sure to cut the dwarf off before he could go any further. You seem to know your way around the city, though. Fenrina peered back at Steve. So you don't seem to mind whatever the implication is? Steve chuckled as she said that and kept pushing them along. Yeah, I don't really have any kind of halfway decent reputation anyway. Can't go any further down if you're already rock bottom. But yeah, I've been here. You know how I hate it when I'm told not to do something and there doesn't seem to be any good reason behind it? The werehusky nodded as he asked. Oh yes, I've never seen the nice Archon lady get more frustrated than when you keep asking her why a whole bunch in a row to her answers. Sherry and Larry chuckled at that, and Steve coughed before continuing. Well, before I was actually allowed into the Forbidden Archives, I had to learn about the less noble forms of magic from other places. So having heard the rumors, I came to the city one summer hiatus at the tender age of 25. All I found that first summer was rumors. Well, rumors and a lot of bars, parties, and what passes for sin on this continent. However, I couldn't shake an odd feeling when I was here. Then on the last day, I met someone. I didn't think much of them at the time, but they told me if I came back next summer, I should try the bayou itself, not the city, and that they'd be happy to be my guide. While I'm much more familiar with cliches now, back then, I wasn't, so I had no idea my simple guide was far more than that. He taught me a great deal about forbidden magic back then. He seemed very appreciative that I understood that magic is just magic. It's how you use it, or even why you use it, that matters most. Steve explained as he pushed them further away from the city. You seriously didn't recognize the whole seemingly normal but really powerful, not who they seem guide-mentor cliché? Sherry asked with a giggle as Steve sighed. She had disguised herself as a human while they were in the city, but had dropped now that they were underway and was her normal, half-demonic self. I really didn't. Remember, I grew up on a farm, and then in Orbitus. Not a lot of bards singing tales of adventure in either place, he pointed out. Well, I thought it was really neat, Fenrina said. It was a touch creepy, though. What's with all those stone buildings with dead people in them? The fancy ones. What did you call them? The mausoleums, Steve mentioned. They prefer to bury the dead in fancy caskets and stuff on this continent. Total waste, if you ask me. But since they can't bury anyone in the city, they store them above ground. Why can't they bury them? Fenrina asked. 'Cause it's all swamp. Dig a hole in that city and chances are it'll flood. The whole place is like a bowl surrounded by soup, Steve explained with a snort. Your people don't bury their dead, do they? What do Almarins do? She asked then. We burn our dead. Few things you can do with the ashes. Most people with land mix them in with the soil to keep it fertile. They say it's because their spirits help enrich the land, but I think it's just 'cause dead people are good fertilizer. If you don't own land, then you might spread the ashes around places they liked to hang out in life, or even have the ashes mixed into concrete bricks. Some people live in houses made out of their ancestors. Some people think that's morbid, but I'd be more concerned about the structural integrity of the material, Steve said with a shrug. Do you have plans with what to do when you die? Fenrina asked then. Probably mixed in with my garden, maybe something special. I haven't given it too much consideration because I'm going to live forever. Steve grinned at her, but then he looked over his shoulder at the city in the distance behind them. Okay, this should be far enough. Make sure everything is secure. So, what's this trick you mentioned? Fenrina asked while she watched the others. A handy trick I learned. You'll see, he mentioned as he fixed a specially designed rudder on the back of the boat. What made it special was the Gale gem fixed to it. We all set? He asked as he pulled a pair of goggles from one of his many pockets and fixed them to his face, and then tied some cloth over his mouth. He looked around to make sure the others had done the same, and then took his seat at the back of the boat. Setting his hand on the rudder, he focused for a moment, took a breath, and then said the words. In an instant, the gem had kicked up a gale of wind all right, and they were being hurled forward, skimming across the waters of the bayou at speeds that most were entirely unfamiliar with. However, while Larry and Sherry were clinging to their seats, Fenrina actually took off the cloth over her muzzle so she could open her mouth wide, snapping at the wind as they went. Steve laughed at the sight of her tongue waving in the wind and wanted to ask her about it, but with all the sound of wind rushing past them, he couldn't hear her over the work of the gem, so he saved his curiosity for later. Even with Steve's trick to help them traverse the bayou with extreme speed, it was getting dark when they finally reached his destination, an unnamed village built up on stilts. There were few towns or villages within the bayou, despite how important the greater delta was for trade. The large trees, swampy terrain, and dark nature of the place made most people feel uneasy. Those that did settle deep within the boundaries of the bayou proper were often close-knit and mistrusting of outsiders, which was wise considering what else happened to live in the bayou with them. Before they got too close, Steve gave Sherry time to get back into her human disguise. Then he used the pole to push them closer instead of using the noisy and attention-drawing wind magic rudder. However, even before he could really see the village proper, he felt like he could feel someone's eyes on him, and it began to make him uneasy. Once he pushed them in close to the two crooked wooden piers that made up the village's dock, Sherry got off the front to tie them off to a post. "Right. Larry, you stay here. We'll get supplies and I'll see if I can find out where the manor has moved to," Steve mentioned as he pulled the cloth free of his face, but left his goggles on in case they'd need to get out of the town in a hurry. "Now why has Larry Love got to stay in the boat? Larry Love has yet to meet the fine ladies of the deep bayou," the dwarf mentioned as he tried to get up on his tiptoes to peer over the top of the pier to see if anyone was around on the raised catwalks connecting the structures. "And we're going to keep it that way because the last thing we need is for us to get chased out of here by a bunch of angry peasants with torches. This boat is made of wood after all," Steve pointed out and then stepped off the front of the boat with Fenrina. "I saw how much you liked the ride," he mentioned. "Oh yeah, it was really fun. I don't know why, but I just had to keep my mouth open. It felt amazing." Her tail was wagging so hard he might have been able to use it to propel them through the bayou without the wind magic. "Ooh, and look at those gold specks. They're so pretty," she gasped, and Steve looked around to see the fireflies start to light up around them as it got dark. "Yeah, those are fireflies. They're pretty, but don't touch them or try and catch any in your hands," Steve mentioned. "Why not?" she asked, as she began to follow him along the wooden walkway from the dock up to the nearest structure. "Because they'll burst into flames," he explained, as if that should be obvious from the name. "Oh, but I'm still wearing the fire necklace, remember?" She tapped the necklace he'd gotten her for the library job. "Oh yeah, well, still don't do it. This place is made of wood just like the boat," he pointed out. "Steve, is it me, or did it get dark early?" Sherry asked then, and he paused to look around slowly at the village around them. He couldn't actually see anyone, but that made him more nervous rather than less. Strangers should bring out a crowd, or at least a few curious types. But here he saw no one, yet he could still feel eyes upon him. "Yeah, just stay alert," he advised as he headed into the general store that was at the edge of the village and one of the largest structures, partially built onto a small hill sticking up out of the water and not entirely on stilts like the others. When he stepped inside, he noticed how it smelled damp and musty. Fenrina even sneezed once she stepped inside, and he could see the sheer volume of dust filtering through the air thanks to the light of the fireflies outside. Behind a counter, a shadow detached from the wall and smiled at them. "Ah, welcome in potential customers," the shadow then said as Steve walked closer to see a smiling merchant waving him forward. He looked to be mostly human, but a great deal of Ormolians had a touch of elven in their blood, though there was something off about him. Steve paused then and glanced around the building a bit more carefully. "Looking for something, friend?" "Yeah, wondering where your cats are. Cats usually like me," he mentioned, and while the merchant's mouth continued to smile, his eyes didn't. "No cats here, friend," the merchant said as Steve stepped up to the counter. Steve hummed softly as he glanced around once more. Things seemed off. The food and supplies he expected to at least be kept looking nice all seemed slightly damp and moldy. If the merchant was old and too lazy or weak to keep things clean, he might understand, but the person standing before him seemed to be young and spry. "I'm wondering if you might be able to give me directions." "Ah, lost in the bayou, are you? Many a traveler has gotten lost in here, friend. It's dark out. I suggest you rest your weary heads in our tavern. Warm beds and a deep sleep will do you good." The merchant's smile was plastered on his face, but if anything that made Steve more suspicious than anything else. "I know exactly where I am. It's just that I'm not sure where I'm going. I'm looking for a manor. It moves around," Steve mentioned, and once again saw the smile fade from the merchant's eyes, even if his lips were stuck in place. "Manors don't move, friend. You look like the sort who ought to know that," the merchant replied. "Oh, but this one does. Everyone must have heard of the Cock Manor." He was startled by Fenrina laughing loudly behind him, and he looked over his shoulder at her. "Seriously? Did someone really name their manor that? Hey, come on down to Penis House." She laughed and giggled somewhat, spoiling the dark, serious mood that had fallen over them until then. "It's another word for a rooster," Steve explained. Fenrina blinked then for a moment and tilted her husky head to the side in a way that never failed to make him smile and want to squeeze her face. "Really? I had no idea," she exclaimed. "So, when I hear Larry talking about it, he's talking about a rooster?" "Oh!" Steve looked to Sherry, who just stared back at him until he blinked. Yee. He coughed then and looked back at the merchant. "But seriously, everyone knows the legend of the Rooster Manor." He glanced at Fenrina for a moment as she still giggled a little. "You can't tell me you don't know the legend." Even as he said that, the merchant just kept on smiling at him. "Oh yes, I've heard of it. Haven't we all? But it's not real, friend. I'm afraid you're just chasing around an old myth if you're looking for the manor. Magister Malin no longer lives in the bayou, you see." When he said that, Steve had to keep calm and not reveal anything. Instead, he smiled and nodded to a fancy sword up on a high shelf behind the merchant. "Mind if I see that blade, friend? That looks like something I might be interested in purchasing." As he told the merchant that, he watched that gleam in the merchant's eyes grow. "Oh yes, an excellent choice, friend. Though it does come with a steep price. Let me get that for you." Once the merchant's back was turned, however, Steve pulled out his own knife and cut open his right palm. Then he used the blade to draw a circle on the counter, then a cross, then an X over that. Once the symbol was complete, he pressed his bleeding palm firmly against the carving and hissed for a moment as he felt the cut seal shut. He looked around while the merchant pulled the sword down off the shelf and then spotted what he was looking for. A pair of golden cat eyes in the dark back of the store flared to life. As the merchant turned back, Steve kept his knife in his other hand under the counter and out of sight.